In a silent cemetery, where tears mix with the morning's fine rain, a solemn funeral is abruptly interrupted by a scene that leaves everyone in shock. A majestic white horse, which belonged to the 7-year-old girl being buried, invades the ceremony and, ignoring desperate screams, begins to dig the newly closed grave with fierce determination. The mourners watch horrified as the animal digs tirelessly until, when they look inside the excavated hole, they discover something impossible. Something that leaves them in complete shock and makes them question who could have committed such an act. If you, like us, love animals, subscribe now to the channel so you don't miss any emotional stories. Thank you. Let's get back to our story. The fine morning rain wove a melancholic veil over Evergreen Memorial Park, where tears mingled. With the drops cascading down grief-stricken faces, the muffled sound of sobs echoed among the old headstones as a small white coffin was slowly lowered into the damp earth. Helena Reed, just 7 years old, was being laid to rest in a ceremony that was supposed to be the final farewell to a life cut short too soon. Her father, Edward Mason, stood erect as a statue beside the grave, his face a mask of controlled agony. At 45, the industrial magnate had built an empire based on absolute control of every situation, but today he seemed vulnerable before the inevitability of death. His immaculate black suit contrasted with the pallor of his skin, and his gloved hands firmly gripped the ivory cane he carried for elegance, not necessity. Across the grave, Martha Reed, Helena's maternal grandmother, observed her son-in-law with piercing eyes. At 70, she maintained the haughty posture that had always characterized her, but something in her gaze suggested a deep disquiet. Her trembling hands clutched an embroidered handkerchief, an heirloom from her own mother, as she whispered silent prayers for the granddaughter she loved unconditionally. Father Michael continued his solemn homily when a distant sound began to echo through the morning mist. First, it was only a barely perceptible rumor, like distant thunder. Then the sound intensified, transforming into the unmistakable gallop of hooves against the soaked ground. Those present raised their eyes, confused, searching for the source of the growing noise. Suddenly, through the fog that hung among the cypress trees, a majestic figure emerged that made everyone instinctively recoil. It was Tempest, the white horse Helena loved so much, his silver mane floating like silk in the wind as he galloped towards the group. His eyes, normally serene, shone with a wild intensity no one had ever witnessed. Edward stepped forward, extending a hand in an attempt to calm the animal, but Tempest ignored him completely. The horse passed right by him, as if the man were transparent, and headed directly for the open grave. His movements were precise, determined, as if he knew exactly what he needed to do. The mourners watched in horror as Tempest began to dig at the soil with his front hooves, throwing damp earth in all directions. His whinnies echoed through the cemetery like cries of despair, a sound that sent shivers down anyone's spine. The animal dug with a fury that seemed supernatural, completely ignoring the shouts and attempts of those present to pull him away. John, the gravedigger, a simple man, tried to approach with a rope, but Tempest pushed him away with a sharp toss of his head, never stopping his digging. His hooves worked with surgical precision, removing layer after layer of earth as if following a specific mental map. With each movement of the animal, the silence among the mourners grew denser. Something was terribly wrong. Tempest's behavior was not that of a grieving animal, but rather of a creature driven by a purpose that transcended human understanding. His eyes glowed with a determination that spoke of knowledge, of hidden truths that only he seemed to perceive. Edward tried to approach again, this time shouting authoritative commands that always worked with the horse, but Tempest continued digging as if the man didn't even exist. Dirt flew in all directions, staining the elegant clothes of those present, who recoiled further and further, seized by a terrible premonition. When the horse's hooves finally reached the bottom of the grave, the sound that echoed was different from what was expected. It wasn't the dull thud of wood being hit, but the hollow echo of an empty space. Tempest stopped abruptly, raised his head, and let out a whinny that chilled the blood of everyone present. The most shocking truth came to light at that moment. There was no coffin buried there. The silence that followed the discovery was deafening. Those present at the funeral remained motionless, like salt statues trying to process what their eyes had just witnessed. The empty grave seemed like an abyss that sucked all logic and reason from that solemn moment. Tempest remained at the bottom of the hole, his dilated nostrils exhaling vapor into the cold morning air, as if waiting for someone to finally understand his desperate message. Edward was the first to break the collective stupor. His voice, normally firm and controlled, came out trembling as he shouted at the gravedigger, "John, what does this mean? Where is my daughter's coffin?" His words echoed through the cemetery like a lament, but there was something in his tone that sounded more like panic than genuine surprise. John, the gravedigger, a 60-year-old man who had worked at that cemetery for over 3 decades, looked at the empty grave with an expression of complete perplexity. His calloused hands trembled as he approached the edge, trying to understand how this was possible. "Mr. Mason, I myself placed the coffin here last night. Everything was in order, I swear on my late wife's soul." Martha, Helena's grandmother, watched the scene with a mixture of shock and something that could be described as growing suspicion. Her keen eyes alternated between her agitated son-in-law and the horse that remained at the bottom of the grave, as if protecting something invisible. She had raised 5 children and lived long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. And at that moment, every fiber of her being screamed that this situation went far beyond a simple mistake. Tempest, as if sensing the weight of the gazes upon him, raised his head and emitted a low sound, almost a whimper, that made everyone's hearts clench. It wasn't a common whinny, but a vocalization charged with emotion, as if the animal was trying to communicate something urgent that only he understood. Father Michael, a kind man who had known the family for years, approached the grave with cautious steps. "My children, there is certainly an explanation for this. Perhaps the coffin was placed elsewhere by mistake." His words sounded weak even to himself, as he tried to maintain calm amid the growing chaos. Edward began to pace in circles, his hands nervously running through his perfectly combed hair. "This is an outrage, a scandal. How can there be such incompetence?" He gesticulated frantically, but Martha noticed that his complaints seemed more aimed at diverting attention than seeking genuine answers. Among the guests, whispers began to spread like wildfire. They were mostly neighbors and acquaintances of the family, people who had watched Helena grow up and who now found themselves in a situation that defied all logic. Mrs. Carmen, the closest neighbor, clutched her husband Anthony's arm and whispered, "Anthony, did you see how that horse knew exactly where to dig, as if he knew?" John, still trying to understand the situation, murmured more to himself than to others. "But the coffin was heavy yesterday, very heavy. I needed 2 men to help carry it." His words were heard by Martha, who immediately turned to him with renewed interest. "Heavy, John? Are you sure it was heavy?" Martha's voice cut through the air like a blade, silencing the whispers around them. Her eyes gleamed with an intensity that made Edward visibly stiffen. The gravedigger paused to think, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Well, now that you mention it, it was heavy when we arrived here, but when we went to lower it, now that I think about it, it seemed lighter. I thought it was strange at the time, but I was tired and didn't think much of it." This revelation dropped like a bomb on the group. Tempest, as if understanding the importance of those words, emitted another low sound and began to walk in circles within the grave, his hooves treading on the earthen bottom as if searching for something specific. Edward, realizing the situation was spiraling out of his control, tried to take the lead again. "Enough! This is ridiculous. Let's get this animal out of here and call the authorities to resolve this confusion." But when he tried to approach the grave, Tempest stared at him with an intensity that made him recoil instinctively. Martha stepped forward, her voice firm, cutting through the tension. "Edward, where exactly did you say Helena passed away? And why wasn't I allowed to see her before the funeral?" Martha's question hung in the air like a storm-laden cloud. Edward felt the weight of everyone's gaze upon him. And for the first time in years, the man who controlled an industrial empire found himself speechless. His hands trembled slightly before he managed to regain his composure, but Martha, with her 70 years of experience reading people, missed no detail. Helena. Helena was admitted to a specialized clinic in Los Angeles, Edward finally replied, his voice sounding more controlled but still forced. "The doctors said it would be better. It would be easier for everyone if she passed peacefully, without visits that might disturb her in her final moments." Martha narrowed her eyes, her memories of her granddaughter returning like powerful waves. Helena wasn't just a special child because of her specific needs. She was a radiant girl, full of life, who found joy in the simplest things. Her mornings were always marked by a run to the stable to greet Tempest, and afternoons stretched into long walks across the fields, where she talked to the horse as if he were her best friend. "What exactly was the illness?" Martha insisted, stepping closer to her son-in-law. "When we talked on the phone last week, you only said she had a bad flu. How did a flu turn into this?" Tempest, still at the bottom of the grave, seemed to react to the mention of Helena. His ears perked up and he began to make circular movements, as he always did whenever the girl came to visit him. It was a behavior everyone there recognized, a dance of joy the horse always performed when he sensed the presence of his little companion. Edward cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the public interrogation. "Martha, this is neither the time nor the place for medical discussions. We are all distraught, and we need to focus on finding Helena's coffin." But Martha was not willing to let the matter drop. Her memories of her last conversation with her granddaughter, just 10 days earlier, were crystal clear. Helena had called, excited, telling her about the new tricks she was teaching Tempest, about the drawing she was making for her father's birthday, about plans for the approaching school vacation. There was nothing in the girl's voice to suggest illness, much less anything terminal. "John," Martha turned to the gravedigger, completely ignoring Edward's growing discomfort. "You said the coffin was heavy when it arrived, but lighter at the time of the burial. Is that possible?" The simple man scratched his head, his honest eyes reflecting the genuine confusion he felt. "Mrs. Reed, in all my years working here, I've never seen anything like it. Coffins don't just get lighter on their own, unless—" He paused as if a terrible idea had crossed his mind. "Unless what, John?" Martha's voice was firm, encouraging. "Unless there was nothing inside it from the beginning, or someone removed what was inside after we arrived at the cemetery." The silence that followed these words was broken only by the sound of Tempest digging again, his hooves finding something that made a distinct metallic clinking sound. Everyone moved closer to the edge of the grave to see what the horse had uncovered. It was a small golden buckle, the kind used on children's shoes. Martha recognized it immediately. It was from Helena's special shoes, the ones she only wore on important occasions because they made her feet look like a princess. Edward visibly paled at the sight of the buckle, and Martha didn't miss his reaction. "These were the shoes Helena was wearing when you took her to Los Angeles," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. I don't remember details. About shoes, Edward stammered, but his voice sounded less and less convincing. Tempest, after finding the buckle, stopped digging and raised his head towards a specific part of the cemetery. His eyes fixed on a distant point among the trees, and he emitted a low whinny, almost a call. It was as if he was trying to communicate a direction, a path that only he knew. Father Michael, who had remained silent watching the situation unfold, finally spoke. "My children, perhaps we should call the authorities. This situation is beyond our comprehension." But before anyone could respond, Tempest did something that left everyone breathless. He looked directly at Martha and nodded his head, as if agreeing with something that only he and she understood. Then the horse leapt gracefully out of the grave and began to walk slowly towards the trees, stopping every few feet to look back, as if inviting someone to follow him. Martha felt her heart race. Every maternal and grandmotherly instinct she possessed screamed that Helena was alive, somewhere waiting to be found. 3 days had passed since the interrupted funeral, and the Mason estate had become a place of palpable tension. Edward had managed to convince local authorities that it was an administrative error by the cemetery, using his influence and connections to avoid a deeper investigation. But within the walls of his property, a silent battle was being waged. Charles Stone, the farm's horse handler, watched Tempest with growing concern. At 52, Charles had dedicated his life to animal care, and he had never witnessed behavior like the white horse displayed since the funeral. The animal adamantly refused to eat, standing for hours, staring fixedly in the same direction, always towards the mountains rising north of the property. "Come on, boy, you need to eat," Charles murmured softly, bringing a bucket of fresh oats closer to the horse. But Tempest didn't even lower his head to sniff the food. His eyes, normally serene and confident, shone with an intensity that made Charles uneasy. Charles had started working on the estate when Helena was just 3 years old. He vividly remembered the first meeting between the girl and the white foal that Edward had bought as a birthday present for his daughter. The connection between them had been instantaneous and magical, something Charles, even with all his experience, had never witnessed before. Helena used to spend hours in the stable talking to Tempest in her imaginative, childish language. She invented stories about knights and princesses, always with Tempest as the main hero. The horse, in turn, showed extraordinary patience and gentleness with the girl, allowing her to brush him, adorn his mane with flowers, and even nap leaning against his flank during hot summer afternoons. "Where is she? Isn't she?" Charles whispered to Tempest, gently stroking his neck. "You know she's not gone. You know she's somewhere needing help." As if responding to the question, Tempest emitted a low sound and turned his head towards Charles, his large, expressive eyes seeming to plead for understanding. It was a look that spoke of urgency, of secrets only he knew, of a truth that desperately needed to be revealed. Charles had noticed other strange things in recent days. Edward, who used to visit the stables regularly to check on his award-winning racehorses, hadn't appeared once since the funeral. Furthermore, he had given specific orders for Tempest to be kept in his stall, claiming the animal was too disturbed to be let out into the pasture. But Charles knew horses better than anyone in the region, and he knew Tempest wasn't disturbed. He was determined. There was a crucial difference between the two states, and anyone with real animal experience would be able to perceive it. During his nightly rounds through the stable, Charles had begun to follow Tempest's fixed gaze, trying to understand what the horse saw or felt in the direction of the mountains. The night before, he had walked to the fence that bordered the property, in that direction, and noticed something that made him stop suddenly. There were recent tracks in the mud, heavy masculine boot prints going to and from a trail leading to the mountains. The marks were deep, suggesting that whoever had made them was carrying something heavy. Charles knew the property like the back of his hand, and he knew the trail led to an old cabin that Edward had ordered built years ago, claiming it would be used as a retreat for moments of reflection. But Charles had never seen his boss use the cabin once. On the morning of this fourth day, Charles made a decision that would change everything. He waited for Edward to leave for one of his business meetings in the city, and then opened Tempest's stall. "Let's find out what you're trying to tell me, boy," he murmured, placing a light rope around the horse's neck. Tempest reacted immediately, as if he had been waiting for this moment for days. He walked out of the stable with determined steps and began walking directly towards the north fence, following exactly the path Charles had explored the night before. As they walked the steep trail up the mountain, Charles noticed that Tempest seemed to know the way perfectly, as if he had traveled that route before. The horse occasionally stopped, raising his head to sniff the air, and then continued with renewed determination. After 40 minutes of walking, they reached a clearing where the old wooden cabin stood among the trees. Charles felt his heart race when he noticed clear signs of recent use. A small pile of trash beside the building, tire marks in the soft earth, and something that chilled him completely, a small rag doll lying near the door. It was Helena's inseparable doll, the one she had carried everywhere since she was 4 years old. Tempest approached the cabin and began to walk in circles, emitting low sounds that echoed through the silent forest. It was as if he was calling someone, as if he knew someone very special had been there recently. Charles picked up the doll with trembling hands, his heart beating so hard he could hear it echo in his ears. While Charles was making his disturbing discovery on the mountain, Martha was on her own investigative mission in the city. The 70-year-old woman had spent sleepless nights since the funeral, her suspicions about Edward growing like a storm in her chest. She knew her daughter better than anyone, and she knew she would never have allowed Helena to be admitted to a clinic without, at least, a farewell call. Sitting in the modest office of Private Detective Robert Davidson, Martha watched the 50-year-old man carefully examine the few documents she had managed to gather. Robert was a former police officer who had opened his own practice after retiring, known in the city for his discretion and efficiency in sensitive cases. "Mrs. Reed, I need to be honest with you," Robert said, adjusting his glasses as he studied the papers. "The documents Edward presented to the authorities regarding Helena's admission are curious. There are some inconsistencies that caught my attention." Martha leaned forward, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "First, the hospital mentioned in the documents exists, but when I discreetly called to verify, they have no record of any Helena Reed or Helena Mason admitted in the last 3 months. Second, the medical signatures on the report seem forced." Robert paused, observing Martha's reaction before continuing. "But what worries me most is how quickly everything happened. According to the documents, Helena was diagnosed with a terminal illness on a Monday and passed away on Thursday of the same week. For a healthy child, that's practically impossible." Martha felt her hands tremble. She had always suspected something was wrong, but hearing professional confirmation of her suspicions left her simultaneously relieved and terrified. "Robert, do you think my granddaughter is still alive?" The detective chose his words carefully. "Mrs. Reed, based on what I've seen so far, I believe there's a very real possibility that Helena has not died. The question now is to find out where she is and why Edward orchestrated this charade." As they talked, Robert's phone rang. It was one of his hospital contacts returning his call about Helena. Martha watched the detective's face change as he listened to the information on the other end of the line. "I see. Yes, thank you very much." Robert hung up and turned to Martha with a grave expression. "Mrs. Reed, I just received very important information. Not only was Helena never admitted to that hospital, but the doctors whose names appear on the reports never worked there. The signatures are completely fake. Martha's world seemed to stop for a moment. The confirmation that Edward had faked Helena's death brought a devastating mix of relief and horror. Her granddaughter was alive, but that meant she was in danger at the hands of a man who had clearly lost all sense of humanity. But why? Martha murmured, more to herself than to Robert. Why would a father do that to his own daughter? Robert had investigated many cases throughout his career, including some involving dysfunctional families and financial matters. Mrs. Reed, based on what I know about Edward Mason, I believe this may be related to his personal and professional life. He has international expansion plans for his company, and there are rumors of an imminent marriage to Victoria Sterling, the socialite. Martha knew Victoria superficially, a cold and calculating woman who made it clear she had no patience for children, especially those with special needs like Helena. Do you think, Edward, that he did this to get rid of Helena? It's a possibility we need to consider, Robert replied gravely. Children with special needs can be seen as obstacles by people obsessed with public image and social status. Martha felt nauseated at the thought of the coldness this represented. Helena was a sweet, innocent child who brought joy to everyone around her. The idea that her own father saw her as a problem to be eliminated was almost unbearable. Robert, what do we do now? She asked, her voice laden with determination despite the pain. First, we need to find physical evidence to prove our suspicions. Second, we need to find out where Helena is being held, because if our theory is correct, she is in imminent danger. At that moment, Martha's phone rang. It was Charles, the horse handler, his voice trembling with excitement and fear. Mrs. Reed, you need to come here urgently. Tempest led me to a cabin on the mountain, and I found Helena's doll, the one she always carried. Martha jumped up, her heart pounding. Charles, are you sure it's her doll? Absolutely, Mrs. Reed. And there's more. There are signs that someone has been here recently. Food, trash, tire marks. This cabin has been used in the last few days. Robert, who had overheard the conversation, immediately stood up and grabbed his keys. Mrs. Reed, I think we just found out where Helena is being held. As they rushed out of the office, Martha felt a mixture of hope and terror growing in her chest. Her granddaughter was alive, but every passing minute could be crucial to saving her from the hands of a man who had proven capable of anything. The dirt road leading to the Mason estate had never seemed so long to Martha. Sitting in the passenger seat of Robert's car, she clutched Helena's doll to her chest, her tears dampening the worn fabric that still held the faint scent of her granddaughter. Charles had come down from the mountain to meet them at the farm gate, his face etched with the tension of someone who had witnessed something that had changed his understanding of the world. Mrs. Reed, when I found the doll, Tempest became very agitated, Charles explained as he led them along the steep trail. He kept calling, making those sounds he only made when little Helena would hide from him during their games. It was as if he knew she was nearby but couldn't find her. Robert carefully observed every detail of the path, his former police experience making him notice things others might overlook. The tire marks in the mud were recent, probably 2 or 3 days old. There were overlapping footprints, suggesting multiple trips to the location. More disturbingly, he noticed small pieces of blue fabric caught in the bushes along the trail, the same color as the dress Helena wore in recent photos Martha had shown him. When they reached the clearing where the cabin stood, Tempest awaited them like a silent guardian. The white horse immediately approached Martha, gently nudging her shoulder with his muzzle, as if understanding that she was the only person there who could truly help Helena. The cabin was a simple wooden structure built years ago as a supposed retreat, but which had clearly been adapted for a much more sinister purpose. Robert approached the small window and peered through the dusty glass, using a handkerchief to avoid leaving fingerprints. "My God," he murmured, recoiling from the window with an expression of shock. "What is it? What did you see?" Martha asked, rushing to his side. Robert gently prevented her from looking. "Mrs. Reed, perhaps it's best if I describe it. There's clear evidence that a child was held captive here recently." Inside the cabin, Robert had seen a scene that deeply revolted him. A small bed with soiled sheets, half-eaten plates of food, and most disturbingly, cut ropes discarded in the corner. Ropes that had clearly been used to restrain someone. There were also empty vials of sedative medication scattered across the rustic table. Charles, who had remained silent until then, pointed to an area behind the cabin. "Mrs. Reed, there's one more thing you need to see. Tempest showed me." They followed the handler to a small space behind the structure, where the earth had been recently disturbed. In the middle of the moved soil, almost hidden among the leaves, were Helena's special shoes, the ones with the golden buckles that made her feet look like a princess. One of the shoes still had its buckle, but the other was missing it, explaining how the piece had ended up in the cemetery grave. Martha fell to her knees beside the shoes, her hands trembling violently. He took her shoes off. Why would he take her shoes off? Robert knelt beside Martha, his voice gentle but determined. "Mrs. Reed, I believe Edward used these shoes to lend credibility to the fake funeral. He needed something personal of Helena's to convince people she had actually died." Tempest approached the spot where the shoes had been found and began to sniff the ground intensely. Suddenly, he raised his head and let out a loud whinny that echoed through the forest, a sound that carried urgency and something that almost seemed like despair. "He's trying to tell us something," Charles observed, knowing the horse's behavior patterns well. "Tempest only makes that sound when he feels Helena is in immediate danger." Robert quickly stood up, his mind processing the evidence. If Helena was here until recently, but isn't anymore, that means Edward moved her to another location, and if Tempest is sensing urgency, it means time is running out, Martha completed, her voice laden with horror and determination. At that moment, they heard the sound of an engine approaching on the trail. Robert immediately motioned for everyone to hide behind the cabin while he peered through the bushes to see who was arriving. It was Edward, driving a black Jeep, alone. His face was tense, and he carried a large bag on the passenger seat. When he got out of the vehicle, they could see that his clothes were rumpled and his hands trembled slightly, signs of extreme stress. Edward walked directly to the cabin, opened the door with a key, and quickly entered. Sounds of heavy movement came from inside, as if he was removing or reorganizing large objects. Robert whispered to Martha and Charles, "He's eliminating evidence. This confirms our theory. Helena was here, and now he's trying to erase all traces." Tempest, still hidden, with them, seemed increasingly agitated. His nostrils flared with each passing second, and he kept his gaze fixed in the opposite direction from the cabin, as if sensing something humans couldn't perceive. "What are you looking at, boy?" Charles murmured, following the horse's gaze. It was then that they realized Tempest wasn't looking at the cabin where Edward was, but in a completely different direction, deeper into the forest, where a second, almost invisible trail disappeared among the dense trees. Helena was no longer in the cabin. She had been moved to an even more isolated and dangerous location. The sound of Edward's footsteps leaving the cabin made everyone shrink further behind the bushes. Robert held Martha's arm, preventing her from making any movement that could reveal their presence. Charles kept a gentle hand on Tempest's neck, trying to calm the horse, who showed increasing signs of agitation. Edward carefully locked the cabin and returned to the Jeep, But instead of leaving immediately, he stopped and looked around the clearing with an expression of extreme paranoia. It was as if he felt he was being watched. His eyes scanned the dense vegetation, passing dangerously close to where they were hiding. After long minutes that seemed like hours, Edward finally got into the vehicle and drove away, but not on the main trail that led back to the property. Instead, he followed exactly the direction Tempest had indicated, along the secondary trail that disappeared deeper into the forest. "Now we know for sure where Helena is," Robert whispered, his voice urgent. "But we need to be very careful if Edward discovers us." Martha stood up with determination, wiping dirt from her knees. "I don't care what happens to me. My granddaughter is in danger, and I'm not going to stand here while that monster might be hurting her." Tempest, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, positioned himself beside Martha and lowered his head slightly, as he always did when Helena needed his help to climb onto his back. The gesture was so touching and natural that it brought tears to everyone's eyes. "He wants you to ride him," Charles observed with admiration. "Tempest knows it's the only way we can reach Helena in time." Robert, still cautious, checked his cell phone and confirmed what he already expected. There was no signal in the mountainous region. "I can't call for backup from here. We're on our own." The secondary trail was much steeper and more dangerous than the first. Centuries-old trees formed a thick canopy that blocked almost all sunlight, creating a dark and claustrophobic atmosphere. Tempest led the way, his keen instincts guiding them along a path that seemed impossible to find without his help. As they advanced, they began to hear disturbing sounds coming from further ahead, male voices discussing something in low, urgent tones. Robert gestured for them to stop and carefully approached a rock formation that offered a privileged view of the valley below. What he saw chilled his blood. In a clearing surrounded by steep cliffs, there was a second, much more primitive cabin. Edward was there, talking animatedly with two large, menacing-looking men. One of them held an open briefcase full of money, while the other pointed to the cabin with gestures that clearly indicated some kind of negotiation. But what shocked Robert most was seeing Edward handing documents to the men, documents that appeared to be passports and travel papers. It was obvious that some kind of transaction was being finalized, and the nature of that transaction was too terrible to fully contemplate. Robert crawled back to where Martha and Charles awaited with Tempest. "Mrs. Reed, the situation is more serious than we imagined. Edward isn't just hiding Helena, he's handing her over to other people." The words hit Martha like a punch to the stomach. "What do you mean? There are men down there receiving money and documents from Edward. They appear to be intermediaries, people who make children disappear permanently." The reality of the situation became crystal clear to all of them. Edward hadn't just temporarily kidnapped Helena out of shame or convenience. He was getting rid of her permanently, handing her over to people who would take her far away, where she would never be found. Tempest, as if sensing the growing urgency of the situation, began to show signs of extreme agitation. He struck the ground with his hooves, his dilated nostrils picking up scents humans couldn't detect. Suddenly, he raised his head and let out a loud, clear whinny that echoed throughout the mountain. The sound had an immediate and unexpected effect. From inside the primitive cabin below came a response. A small, weak voice, but unmistakably familiar, screaming, "Tempest! Tempest, I'm here!" It was Helena, alive, conscious, and clearly recognizing the voice of her dearest companion. Martha couldn't contain herself. Tears streamed from her eyes as she whispered, "My girl, my dear, Helena!" But the joy of the moment was quickly replaced by terror when they saw Edward and the two men exiting the cabin, clearly alarmed by the child's scream. Edward gesticulated frantically, pointing in the direction from which the whinny had come. "They know we're here," Robert murmured, his former police mind already formulating escape and rescue strategies. It was then that Tempest made a decision that would change everything. Without warning, the white horse bolted down the slope towards the clearing, completely ignoring Charles's shouts for him to stop. His hooves thundered against the rocks as he descended like a white avalanche, his mane flying like war banners. The men below scattered in a panic when they saw the massive horse coming towards them. Edward yelled something inaudible and ran towards a third vehicle hidden behind the cabin. Tempest reached the clearing like a force of nature, positioning himself directly between the cabin where Helena was trapped and the men trying to escape. His whinnies echoed through the mountain like declarations of war, and for the first time since the funeral, he seemed truly fierce. It was the decisive moment. The battle for Helena's life had begun, and a white horse was her first and most improbable protector. The chaos that followed Tempest's arrival in the clearing was like an explosion of pure energy. The white horse moved with an agility and ferocity no one had ever witnessed, systematically blocking all attempts by the men to approach the cabin where Helena was trapped. His whinnies echoed through the mountains like battle cries, and his eyes glowed with a determination that bordered on the supernatural. Edward, in absolute panic, shouted contradictory orders to the two henchmen as he tried to reach the getaway vehicle. "Get that animal away! Grab the child and let's go!" His voice had lost all aristocratic composure, revealing the desperation of a man who saw his meticulously laid plans crumbling before his eyes. Martha, Robert, and Charles descended the slope as fast as they could, guided by the sounds of the battle below. Robert had pulled out his phone and miraculously found a small cell signal among the rocks. With trembling fingers, he dialed the authorities as he ran. "This is Robert Davidson, former investigator. I need urgent backup in the mountains of the Mason estate. Minor abduction in progress. Repeat, child in imminent danger." Tempest, meanwhile, displayed impressive tactical intelligence. He had noticed that one of the henchmen was trying to go around the cabin to the right, so he strategically positioned himself to block that route. When the second man tried to approach from the left, the horse quickly spun and confronted him with a series of calculated kicks that made him retreat rapidly. From inside the cabin, Helena's voice continued to scream, "Tempest! I knew you'd come for me! I knew it!" Her voice, though weak, carried a joy and relief that touched everyone's hearts. The girl had kept faith in her companion, even in the darkest moments. Edward, realizing the situation was completely out of control, made a desperate decision. He grabbed a pistol from his vehicle's glove compartment and pointed it directly at Tempest. "Get away, or I'll shoot the horse." It was at that moment that Martha arrived at the clearing, closely followed by Charles and Robert. The sight of Edward pointing a gun at Tempest was too much for her to bear. "You monster! How can you threaten the only being who truly loves your daughter?" "Shut up, old woman!" Edward screamed, his mask of civility completely shattered. "Helena is my daughter, and I decide what happens to her. She's a burden, an obstacle to my future. Victoria would never accept a child like her." Edward's words echoed through the clearing like confessions from a lost soul. Charles, a simple man but with a pure heart, looked at his boss with utter disgust. "Mr. Mason, how can you speak like that about the girl? She's the sweetest, purest creature I've ever known." One of the henchmen, a large, brutal-looking man, tried to take advantage of the distraction to approach the cabin, but Tempest was alert. The horse quickly turned and delivered a precise kick that hit the man in the shoulder, making him cry out in pain and recoil. Robert, with his police experience, began to strategically assess the situation. Edward was visibly unstable, holding the gun with trembling hands. The two henchmen were injured and clearly wanted to abandon the operation. The advantage was shifting to their side, but they needed to be careful not to put Helena in greater danger. Edward, "Think about what you're doing," Robert said in a calm, authoritative voice. "Helena is your daughter. There's a way to resolve this without more violence." "There's nothing to resolve!" Edward shouted, tears of rage and despair streaming down his face. "My whole life has been planned to get where I am. Helena doesn't fit into those plans. She never fit." Tempest, as if understanding every word, positioned himself even closer to the cabin, forming an impenetrable protective barrier. His muscles were tense, ready to react to any threat against Helena. It was then that something unexpected happened. The cabin door opened slightly, and a small hand appeared in the crack. Helena had managed to partially free herself from her restraints and was trying to get out. Her voice, though weak, reached everyone clearly. "Daddy, why are you doing this?" "To me, I just want to go home with Grandma Martha and play with Tempest." The absolute innocence of those words struck Edward like lightning. For a moment, his hand trembled and the gun lowered slightly. It was as if Helena's voice had temporarily broken through the wall of coldness he had built around his heart. But the hesitation lasted only seconds. The sounds of helicopters and sirens began to echo through the mountain. The authorities were arriving. Edward realized his time had run out, and desperation made him harden again. "If I can't have the life I want, then at least I'll make sure Helena doesn't ruin anyone else's life," he murmured, raising the gun again. Tempest seemed to sense the change in Edward's energy. The horse positioned himself directly between Helena and her father, his eyes fixed on the man who had become a threat to the child he vowed to protect. The final confrontation was about to happen, and everyone knew that the next few seconds would determine Helena's fate. Time seemed to freeze at that crucial moment. Edward held the gun with trembling hands, his mind clearly in conflict between the despair of a cornered man and the last vestiges of humanity that still remained in his soul. Tempest remained motionless as a white marble statue, his eyes fixed on the man who represented the greatest threat to Helena's safety. The sounds of the helicopters approached rapidly, echoing through the mountains like the roar of mechanical dragons. Edward looked at the sky with an expression of sheer panic, knowing that every second that passed diminished his chances of escape. The two henchmen, realizing the operation had failed completely, began to retreat towards the dense forest, abandoning Edward to face the consequences alone. "Don't abandon me!" Edward shouted at the fleeing men. "You were paid to finish this job!" But they had already disappeared among the trees, taking with them the briefcase full of money and leaving behind only the echo of broken branches and trampled leaves. Edward was alone, confronted for the first time in his life with the real consequences of his actions, without his money or influence to protect him. Helena, taking advantage of the distraction, managed to open the cabin door a little wider. Her appearance shocked everyone present. She was visibly thinner, her hair disheveled, and her clothes dirty and torn, but her eyes still shone with the same sweetness and determination that had always characterized her. "Tempest," she whispered, extending a small, trembling hand towards the horse. "You came to save me, didn't you? I knew you'd find me." The horse reacted immediately to Helena's voice. He turned slightly, keeping Edward always in his line of sight, but extending his neck so the girl could touch his forehead. The moment of connection between them was so pure and moving that even Robert felt tears well up in his eyes. Martha, taking advantage of Edward being momentarily distracted by the sound of the helicopters, began to move slowly towards the cabin. Each step was calculated, silent, like a determined grandmother who would risk everything to save her granddaughter. "Helena, my dear," she whispered when she was close enough for the girl to hear her. "Grandma's here, you're safe now." Edward noticed Martha's movement and quickly pointed the gun in her direction. "Stay where you are, old woman. Don't come a step closer." It was at that moment that Charles made a courageous decision. The simple, handler who had dedicated his life to animal care and who loved Helena as if she were his own granddaughter, began to speak to Edward in a calm, paternal tone. "Mr. Mason, I've worked for you for 15 years. I've watched you build this empire, seen your determination and intelligence. But I've also seen how little Helena loved you unconditionally. She always spoke of her dad with such pride, always drew pictures of you to hang in the stable." Charles's words penetrated the armor of coldness Edward had built. For the first time in weeks, he remembered the mornings when Helena would run to hug him before he left for work, the childish drawings she made especially for him, the moments when she called him the best daddy in the world. She was always complicated," Edward murmured, his voice laden with a pain he had tried to suppress for so long. Victoria said a child like Helena would be an obstacle, that international. "Business requires a perfect image." "Mr. Mason," Charles continued, taking a cautious step toward his boss, "little Helena is perfect just the way she is. She has a pure heart, a kindness that's rare to find. How can you think that's an obstacle?" Tempest, sensing that the tension was slightly decreasing, began to move slowly toward Helena. His movements were gentle, calculated not to alarm Edward, but determined enough to continue protecting the girl. The helicopters were now very close, and amplified voices began to echo through the clearing. "Edward Mason, this is the police. Drop the weapon and surrender peacefully." Edward looked around the clearing, finally comprehending the complete futility of his situation. He was surrounded, abandoned by his accomplices, confronted by the family he had tried to destroy, and observed by a horse who showed more loyalty and love than he had ever been capable of feeling. I didn't want it to come to this," he whispered, his hands trembling violently. "I just wanted a simple life, without complications." Helena, with the courage only children possess, stepped completely out of the cabin and walked slowly towards her father. Her legs were weak from confinement, but her determination was unshakable. "Daddy," she said with her sweet, innocent voice, "I love you even when you're angry with me. Grandma Martha says families always forgive." Helena's words were like a punch to Edward's gut. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and for the first time in months, saw not an obstacle or a problem, but a child who loved him unconditionally despite everything he had done. The gun began to tremble in his hands, and slowly, very slowly, he began to lower it. The gun fell from Edward's hands as if it had become too heavy to carry. The metallic clatter echoed through the clearing, followed by a silence that seemed to carry the weight of all the repressed emotions of the past few days. Edward collapsed to his knees, his hands covering his face as deep sobs shook his entire body. Helena, with the innocent courage that only children possess, continued walking towards her father. Her legs trembled from the weakness of confinement, but her steps were determined. Tempest accompanied her closely, like a silent guardian ready to protect her if necessary. "Daddy, why are you crying?" Helena asked, her small voice filled with genuine concern, even after everything she had been through. Her first instinct was to comfort her suffering father. Martha rushed to Helena, enveloping her granddaughter in a desperate embrace that seemed to try to make up for all the days of separation and fear. "My girl, my brave little one," she whispered through tears. "Grandma's here. You're safe now." The helicopters finally landed in the clearing, kicking up a cloud of dust and dry leaves. Heavily armed police officers exited the aircraft, but Robert gestured for them to keep their distance. The situation was resolving itself, and an aggressive approach could traumatize Helena even further. Edward lifted his face to look at his daughter, and what Martha saw shocked her deeply. He was no longer the cold, calculating man she knew, but a broken human being, consumed by guilt and the weight of his terrible choices. His eyes were red, his cheeks pale, and his expression carried a regret that seemed to come from deep within his soul. "Helena," he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. Can you forgive your daddy?" The question hung in the air like a desperate plea. Charles, who had witnessed many emotional scenes in his simple life, felt his heart clench at the sight of such a powerful man reduced to begging a 7-year-old child for forgiveness. Helena looked at her father with her large, expressive eyes, those same eyes he had tried to ignore for so long. Slowly, she released herself from Martha's embrace and approached Edward. With her small hands, she gently touched his face, wiping away his tears as she always did whenever she saw someone sad. "Daddy, my teacher at school said that forgiving is what people who love each other do. I love you, so I forgive you. But do you promise you won't ever take me away from home again?" The simplicity and purity of Helena's response completely broke through Edward's last defenses. He enveloped her in a desperate hug, whispering apologies repeatedly. "Forgive me, my princess, forgive me for everything." Daddy was very confused, very lost. "I promise I will never hurt you again." Tempest approached the two, lowering his head to gently touch Helena's shoulder. It was as if the horse was blessing the reconciliation, offering his own form of forgiveness to the man who had caused so much suffering to the girl he loved so dearly. Robert cautiously approached, knowing he had to do his professional duty even amidst that emotionally charged moment. "Edward, you need to come with us. There are many questions that need to be answered, many laws that have been broken." Edward slowly stood up, holding Helena close for a few more seconds before handing her back into Martha's arms. "I know," he said with a firm voice, for the first time in days, showing some dignity. "I know I need to pay for what I did. Just take good care of her. She deserves all the love in the world." The police approached to handcuff Edward, but he did not resist. Before being led away, he turned one last time to Helena. "Princess, Daddy will be away for a while, but I want you to know that you are the most precious thing in his life. Never doubt that." Helena waved goodbye to her father with a touching innocence, not fully understanding the gravity of the situation, but sensing that something important had changed between them. "Bye, Daddy. Tempest and I will wait for you to come back." As Edward was led towards the helicopter, Martha held Helena tightly, whispering words of comfort and love. Charles approached Tempest, stroking the horse's neck with admiration and gratitude. "Boy, you were the hero of this story," he murmured to the horse. "Without you, we would never have found our Helena." Tempest seemed to understand every word. He approached Helena and lowered his head, allowing her to hug him as she used to. The connection between them was stronger than ever, reinforced by the proof that their love could overcome any obstacle. Robert approached Martha, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Reed, Helena will need medical care and psychological support, but she is strong, and with all the love you show her, I'm sure she will make a full recovery." Martha nodded, tears of relief still streaming down her face. She's a fighter, as she always has been, and now she has Tempest back. She has her family. She has everything. She needs to heal. The sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the clearing with golden hues that seemed to symbolize a new beginning. Helena, leaning on Tempest, watched the lights of the helicopters preparing to depart, unaware that she was witnessing the end of a nightmare and the beginning of a new life. 2 weeks had passed since Helena's rescue, and the Mason estate had transformed into a completely different place. Under the legal guardianship of Martha, who had taken custody of her granddaughter, the large house had regained the sounds of childish joy that had been absent for so long. Helena's laughter echoed through the corridors, mingled with the soft sound of Tempest's hooves on the stone patio. Dr. Marina Hayes, the child psychologist recommended by Robert, watched Helena playing in the garden through the window of the office that now served as an improvised therapy room. The 40-year-old professional, specializing in childhood trauma, had been impressed by the girl's resilience, although she knew that the healing process would be long and delicate. "How is she adapting at home?" Dr. Hayes asked Martha, who occupied a comfortable chair beside the mahogany desk Edward used for his business. Martha looked out the window, watching Helena teach Tempest to dance to the tune of a song she hummed. "She still has nightmares, especially in the early hours of the morning. But when that happens, she asks to see Tempest, and that calms her down immediately." The connection between Helena and Tempest had become even deeper after the trauma. The horse seemed to have developed a sixth sense for the girl's emotional needs, always positioning himself close to the house during the night and reacting instantly when she needed comfort. Charles had become much more than a horse handler. He was now a loving, paternal presence in Helena's life. In the afternoons, he taught her how to care for the other animals on the property, always with Tempest carefully supervising every activity. "Mrs. Reed," Charles had said the previous morning, "the girl has a natural gift with animals. They trust her in a way I've never seen before. It's as if she speaks their language." Robert continued to visit regularly, no longer as a detective, but as a family friend who genuinely cared about Helena's well-being. He had become a positive male figure in her life, helping to partially fill the void left by her father's absence. Edward's trial was set for the following month, and although Martha knew it would be a difficult period, she was determined to protect Helena from any additional trauma. The lawyers had ensured that the girl would not have to testify in person, and that her testimony would be recorded in a safe and familiar environment. "Dr. Hayes?" Martha asked with evident concern in her voice. "Helena asks about her father. Sometimes. How should I respond?" The psychologist chose her words carefully. "Age-appropriate honesty is essential. Helena is an intelligent and perceptive child. She knows that something very serious happened, but she doesn't need to know all the sordid details." During her individual sessions with Helena, Dr. Hayes had been impressed by the girl's emotional maturity. Using art therapy techniques, Helena had created drawings that told her own version of the story, always with Tempest as the central hero, always with an ending where the whole family was reunited and happy. "Tempest is my guardian angel," Helena had explained during a session, carefully coloring the horse's silver mane in her drawing. "He always knew where I was, even when I didn't know where I was." Robert's investigations had revealed disturbing details about Edward's plans. Victoria Sterling had been questioned and admitted partial knowledge of the scheme, but claimed she never imagined Edward would go to such drastic extremes. She had called off the engagement immediately and left the country, thus avoiding further legal complications. Edward's company was being managed by a temporary board of directors, and all assets were being evaluated to ensure Helena's financial future. Ironically, the girl he had seen as an obstacle to his wealth would now be the heiress to the entire empire he had built. "Money can't buy back lost time," Martha reflected to Dr. Hayes. "But at least it will ensure that Helena has all the opportunities she deserves when she grows up." At the special needs school where Helena had been enrolled, teachers reported remarkable progress. Her concentration had improved, and she showed extraordinary empathy for other children facing similar challenges. "Helena has an inner light that no trauma could extinguish," her main teacher commented during a meeting with Martha. "She helps other children when they are sad and always talks about Tempest as if he were magic." At night, when Martha tucked Helena into bed, they developed a special ritual. Helena would tell a story about her imaginary adventures with Tempest, always involving missions to help other animals or children in need. It was her way of processing the trauma by transforming it into narratives of heroism and hope. "Grandma," Helena had said the night before, her eyes shining with the premature wisdom that suffering sometimes brings to children. "I think Tempest and I were made to take care of each other, like you and me." Martha had hugged her granddaughter, with tears in her eyes, amazed at a child's ability to find meaning and purpose, even in the most difficult experiences. Dr. Hayes closed her notes and smiled at Martha. "Helena is on the right path to a full recovery. She has something many children in similar situations don't have, a network of unconditional love and a special connection that gives her strength." Through the window, they could see Helena mounted on Tempest, the two walking slowly through the flowering garden, as if dancing a silent waltz of healing and renewal. The courtroom was packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and people who had followed the case through national media. The story of the horse who had exposed a kidnapping by interrupting a fake funeral had captured the public's imagination, transforming Tempest into a kind of national hero. But for Martha, who occupied a seat in the front row, that moment represented much more than a media spectacle. It was the day the truth about Edward would be officially recognized. Helena was at home under the care of Charles and Dr. Hayes, protected from the media circus the trial had become. Martha had insisted that the girl did not need to witness that moment, although she knew she would eventually have to explain the outcome to her granddaughter. Edward entered the courtroom escorted by two officers, his simple prison attire contrasting dramatically with the elegant suits he used to wear. He had lost weight during his weeks in prison, and his face bore the mark of genuine guilt and remorse. When his eyes met Martha's, he lowered his head in a gesture of deep shame. The prosecutor, Mr. Franklin Davies, an experienced man with graying hair, presented a devastating case against Edward. He meticulously described how the defendant had forged medical documents, bribed cemetery officials, and conspired to make his own daughter disappear permanently. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mr. Davies said with a firm voice, "this is not just a kidnapping case. It is a case of a father who was willing to sacrifice the life of his innocent daughter for greed and personal ambition." Robert was called as a key witness, recounting every detail of the investigation that had led to Helena's rescue. His voice choked when he described the state in which they found the girl in the cabin, weak and confused, but still maintaining her unwavering faith that Tempest would come save her. Charles also testified, his simple but powerful voice touching the hearts of everyone in the courtroom. "That horse knew," he said, looking directly at Edward. "Tempest knew something was terribly wrong, and he didn't rest until he found the girl. Animals feel what sometimes we humans can't see." When it was Edward's turn to speak in his own defense, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. He slowly stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared for the most important words of his life. "Your Honor," Edward began, his voice filled with genuine emotion, "I cannot and will not try to justify what I did. There is no justification for a father to try to destroy his own daughter's life." Tears began to stream down his face as he continued, Helena is the purest and most innocent creature I have ever known. She loved me unconditionally, and I repaid that love with cruelty. I was so obsessed with my image, with my business plans, with what other people would think, that I completely lost sight of what truly mattered." Edward paused, wiping his eyes before continuing. "During my weeks in prison, I had time to reflect on who I had become. I turned into a monster, willing to sacrifice my daughter's happiness for selfish goals. Victoria told me that a child like Helena would be an obstacle, and I was too weak to defend her." The courtroom remained in sepulchral silence as Edward struggled to find adequate words to express his remorse. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said, looking directly at where Martha was sitting. I know I can never undo the trauma I caused Helena, but I want everyone to know that what I did was a product of my own weakness and greed, not any deficiency in my daughter. Helena is perfect, exactly as she is." Edward took a deep breath before making his final statement. "I accept any punishment this court deems appropriate. I only—" "Ask that, please. You protect Helena from me. She deserves a life full of love and happiness, something I'm clearly not capable of offering." The judge, Judge Harrison Miller, a wise man with 40 years of experience in the judiciary, observed Edward carefully before pronouncing his words. "Mr. Mason, in all my years presiding over this court, I have rarely witnessed a case as disturbing as this. A father who deliberately puts his own daughter in danger for selfish reasons represents one of the gravest forms of betrayal of parental trust." Judge Miller paused, allowing his words to echo through the room. "However, I must also acknowledge that your remorse seems genuine and that your full confession facilitated the investigation and spared your daughter additional trauma during this process." Martha firmly clutched the strap of her purse, inside which she carried a recent photo of Helena mounted on Tempest, both smiling radiantly for the camera. That image represented everything she had fought for: her granddaughter's happiness and safety. "The sentence will be announced after the recess," the judge declared. This court recognizes the exceptional gravity of this case and the need for justice, not only for the direct victim, but for all of society that relies on the protection of children. As people left the courtroom for the recess, Martha remained seated, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had led to this moment. From a funeral interrupted by a determined horse to this day of reckoning, she had witnessed the transformative power of truth and unconditional love. In her mind, she could visualize Helena at home, probably playing in the garden with Tempest, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the courtroom. That's how it should be. A child protected, loved, and free to simply be a child. When the court reconvened after the recess, the tension in the air was palpable. Judge Harrison Miller returned to his position with a solemn expression that reflected the gravity of the decision he was about to announce. Edward remained standing, his hands clasped in front of his body, accepting whatever fate was imposed upon him. After careful deliberation, the judge began, his voice echoing through the silent room. "This court sentences Edward Mason to 15 years in prison for the crimes of kidnapping, forgery, fraud, and child endangerment. Furthermore, all his assets will be transferred to a trust fund administered by the victim's grandmother, Martha Reed, to ensure Helena's future and well-being." Martha felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been done, but she felt no joy in Edward's downfall, only a deep satisfaction that Helena would now truly be safe. "The court also determines," Judge Miller continued, "that the defendant may receive supervised visits from his daughter should she express a desire to see him, but only after a full psychological evaluation and professional recommendation." Edward accepted the sentence with dignity, simply nodding his head. Before being led away, he asked permission to address a few final words to Martha. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "please tell Helena that that I love her more than anything in this world, and that perhaps one day when she is older she can understand that I was sick, lost, but that never meant she wasn't perfect and loved." Martha nodded, tears in her eyes. "Edward, perhaps you will find peace in prison. And perhaps with time, Helena can find a way to reconcile the father she loved with the man who hurt her." 3 months after the trial, life on the estate had found a new rhythm. Helena had thrived under Martha's loving care, developing a confidence and joy that radiated to everyone around her. Her therapy with Dr. Marina Hayes was progressing extraordinarily well, and the nightmares had practically disappeared. Charles had been officially promoted to estate manager, a position he exercised with pride and dedication. His paternal connection with Helena had deepened, and he often found her in the stable in the morning, talking to Tempest about her dreams from the night before. "You know, Charles," Helena said on a sunny morning, while brushing Tempest's silky mane, "I had a dream where Daddy was in a quiet place, reading books and learning to be a better person." Charles smiled, impressed by the girl's capacity for forgiveness. "And what did you feel in that dream, little one?" "I felt that maybe one day he can go back to being the daddy who took me horseback riding on Sundays," she replied thoughtfully. "Tempest says everyone deserves a second chance." Robert had become a regular visitor, no longer as a detective, but as a dear family friend. He often brought gifts for Helena, adventure books, educational games, and always something special for Tempest, like premium apples or carrots. During one of these visits, Helena asked a question that surprised everyone. "Uncle Robert, when can I visit Daddy?" Martha and Robert exchanged worried glances, but Dr. Hayes, who was present, knelt beside Helena. "Why would you like to visit your father, dear?" "Because Tempest told me in a dream that Daddy is very sad and needs to know that I still love him," Helena replied with the profound simplicity that characterized her. "And because maybe if I tell him it's okay, he can start to heal too." Dr. Hayes was impressed by Helena's emotional maturity. After several preparatory sessions and careful evaluations, she finally recommended that the visit take place, but in a controlled environment and with psychological supervision. The meeting between father and daughter took place in a special room at the prison, designed for sensitive family visits. Edward had cried for hours before the visit, terrified that Helena would reject him or show fear in his presence. When Helena entered the room holding Martha's hand, Edward slowly stood up. He had lost more weight, but his eyes shone with a clarity that had been absent for months. "Hi, Daddy," Helena said simply, as if it had only been a few days since they last saw each other. Edward knelt to be at her height, tears streaming freely down his face. "Hi, my princess. Are you not afraid of me?" Helena shook her head and approached to hug him. "Tempest told me you're learning to be a better person. Is that true?" "I'm trying very hard, Helena. Every day, I'm trying to understand how I became someone who could hurt you, and every day I promise to be better." "Then it's okay," Helena said, caressing her father's face as she used to when she was younger. "People can get lost and then find themselves again. Grandma Martha taught me that." The meeting lasted only an hour, but it was transformative for both. Edward had received the forgiveness he didn't believe he deserved, and Helena had planted the seeds of a possible future. Reconciliation. When they left the prison, Helena was thoughtful. "Grandma, I think Daddy will be okay. He looks different, more like the Daddy I remember from when I was little." Martha kissed her granddaughter's forehead, amazed at a child's capacity for unconditional love. "You have a very special heart, Helena. Tempest chose his best friend well." That night, when they arrived home, Tempest was waiting for them at the gate, as he always did. Helena ran to hug him, whispering in his ear about the visit to her father. The horse listened patiently, as if understanding every word, and then gently carried her to the stable, where she fell asleep leaning against his flank, protected by the purest love there is, that of a true friend. A year had passed since that dramatic funeral that changed everyone's lives forever. The Mason estate, now officially home to Helena and Martha, had transformed into a refuge of peace and joy. What was once a cold and imposing mansion now breathed life, with flowering gardens carefully maintained by Charles and childish laughter echoing through the corridors. Helena, now 8 years old, had grown not only in stature, but in wisdom and confidence. Her golden hair shone in the morning sun as she ran through the verdant field towards the stable, where Tempest awaited her with his characteristic patience. The connection between them had become legendary in the region, inspiring stories that passed by word of mouth about the horse who saved a girl and an entire family. "Good morning, my hero," Helena whispered in Tempest's ear, as she did every morning. The horse responded with a soft puff of air, gently touching the girl's face with his muzzle. It was a ritual of love and gratitude that would never lose its meaning. Martha watched from the porch of the house, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands and a serene smile on her face. At 71, she had found renewed energy in caring for Helena. The responsibility had brought purpose and joy to her golden years, proving that it's never too late to start over. "Mrs. Reed," Charles approached, respectfully removing his hat. "The school called. They want to know if Helena can do a presentation about Tempest for the other children. It seems our girl has become a little celebrity," Martha chuckled softly. Helena had truly become special in the community. Her story of survival and forgiveness had touched many hearts, and she often received letters from children across the country who had heard of her friendship with Tempest. Dr. Marina Hayes had officially concluded Helena's treatment the previous month, declaring that the girl had not only fully recovered from the trauma, but had emerged from the experience with extraordinary emotional maturity. "Helena has a rare gift," the psychologist had explained to Martha. "She transformed her pain into compassion, her experience into wisdom." Robert continued to be a constant presence in their lives, now more like an adopted uncle than a detective. He had recently married a teacher from Helena's school, and the couple frequently visited the property for family dinners full of laughter and stories. Edward had undergone a remarkable transformation in prison. He participated in rehabilitation programs, studied child psychology to better understand Helena's special needs, and wrote weekly letters to his daughter, letters full of love, regret, and hope. Helena responded to all of them, her simple but profound words demonstrating a forgiveness that continued to heal her father's heart. "Daddy is learning to be kind to himself," Helena had explained to Martha after reading the most recent letter. "He says Tempest taught him that everyone deserves love, even people who make big mistakes." The property had become a sanctuary, not just for Helena, but for other children with special needs. Martha had established an equine therapy program where local children came to interact with Tempest and other horses under the supervision of specialized therapists. Helena frequently helped as a little mentor, sharing her special connection with the animals. "Did you see how Joaquin smiled when Tempest touched his hand?" Helena had commented enthusiastically after a recent session. "Horses know when someone needs a friend." On this special anniversary morning of the truth's discovery, Helena had prepared a surprise. She led Tempest to a special spot in the field, the same point where the horse had first stopped to look towards the mountains, sensing something was wrong. "Tempest," she said solemnly, placing a flower crown she had made on the horse's head, "you are my hero forever. Thank you for never giving up on me." The horse remained still as Helena adorned him, as if understanding the importance of that moment. Then, as if responding to her gratitude, he lowered his head and gently touched the girl's heart with his muzzle, a gesture that symbolized the eternal connection between them. Martha approached, carrying a special letter. "Helena, something arrived for you today." It was an official letter informing that Helena had been invited to receive a Children's Medal of Courage from the state government, and that Tempest would be honored as Animal Hero of the Year. The ceremony would take place in the state capital, and the entire family was invited. "Grandma," Helena said after hearing the news, "can I ask for something special?" "Of course, my dear. What would you like?" I want Daddy to know about the medal. And I want to tell him that when he gets out of prison, he will always have a place here with us. Tempest agrees with me. Tears welled up in Martha's eyes. Helena's capacity to forgive and include, even after everything she had been through, was truly extraordinary. As the sun set on that special day, Helena mounted Tempest for her favorite evening walk. They headed to the top of a small hill that offered a panoramic view of the property. There she sat on the soft grass, leaning against the horse's warm flank, watching the golden colors of the sky. "You know, Tempest," she whispered, "I think our adventure taught us something very important, that no matter how lost or scared we get, there's always someone who loves us enough to find us." The horse turned his head slightly to look at her, his large, expressive eyes reflecting all the wisdom and love that had guided their journey since that terrible day in the cemetery. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Helena and Tempest remained there, two friends who had faced the darkness together and emerged into the light, proving that true love and unwavering loyalty can triumph over any adversity. The story that had begun with tears and despair ended with hope and renewal, a testament to the transformative power of unconditional love and unwavering faith.